Before we dive into this powerful story, imagine this. You're sitting in a peaceful park, enjoying the serenity, when suddenly, everything changes with one confrontation. An elderly man is harassed for simply being there, but what happens next will not only shock you but make you question everything about justice and dignity. You won't believe who's watching from behind the scenes. If you're ready to see how one moment can ignite a movement, stay tuned. And if you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to join us on more stories that inspire, inform, and challenge the way we see the world. It was a cool autumn morning in Greenwood Park, the kind of morning when the sun sits low in the sky, casting golden hues on everything it touches. The park was mostly quiet, save for the occasional chirping of birds and the distant sound of children laughing as they raced across the playground. The trees, their leaves slowly turning amber and crimson, swayed gently in the breeze. In the far corner of the park, an elderly black man named Samuel Wright sat alone on a weathered wooden bench, gazing at the duck pond. Samuel had lived in this neighborhood for over 50 years and had seen it change in ways both big and small. The park, however, had always been his sanctuary, a place where he could reflect on his long life, on the years of struggle, love, loss, and joy. At 76, Samuel carried the wisdom of a man who had seen the world both at its best and at its worst. He had fought for civil rights in his youth, had raised 3 children who had all become successful in their own ways, and had recently lost his beloved wife, Gloria, after a long battle with cancer. The park was now one of the few places where he could find solace. Samuel was dressed modestly as always. He wore an old, tan jacket that had seen better days, a wool cap that covered his thinning gray hair, and a pair of brown loafers. In his hand he held a small, worn-out leather book, Gloria's old poetry journal. He often read it to feel close to her again. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, a shadow loomed over him. Startled, Samuel looked up to see a young police officer standing just a few feet away. The officer, tall and muscular with close-cropped hair, had a stern expression on his face. His name tag read Officer Daniels. "Morning, sir," Officer Daniels said, his tone sharp and authoritative. Samuel smiled faintly, nodding. "Good morning, officer. Something I can help you with? You got some ID on you?" Daniels asked, his hand already resting on his belt, where his badge and gun were in full view. Samuel's smile faded. "ID? What for?" Officer Daniels frowned, his posture becoming more aggressive. "There've been reports of suspicious activity around here. Just need to see your ID, sir." Samuel furrowed his brow in confusion. "Suspicious activity? I'm just sitting here, minding my own business." Daniels took a step closer, his tone growing more confrontational. "You match the description of someone we've been looking for. Now, I'm not going to ask you again. Let's see some ID." Samuel's heart began to race. He knew this script all too well. He had lived through decades of being judged and targeted simply for the color of his skin. He had thought those days were behind him, but here it was again, staring him in the face, in the very park he had come to for peace. "I'm 76 years old," Samuel said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not causing any trouble. I come to this park every morning. Surely, you can understand that?" Officer Daniels' eyes narrowed. "I don't care how old you are. I said I need to see your ID. Now, are you going to comply or not?" As the tense exchange between Samuel and Officer Daniels unfolded, neither of them noticed the woman sitting quietly on a bench several yards away. Her name was Jasmine Evans, a journalist for the local newspaper, and she had been enjoying her morning coffee when she first saw Samuel peacefully sitting by the pond. Jasmine had a natural curiosity for people, a skill that had served her well in her career. She often came to Greenwood Park to clear her mind or find inspiration for her stories. Today, however, her peaceful retreat was interrupted when she noticed the officer approaching Samuel. She had seen this kind of encounter before, too many times, in fact, and something in her gut told her to pay attention. Carefully, Jasmine took out her phone and began recording. She had no intention of intervening, at least not yet, but she knew all too well how these situations could escalate. As a black woman, she had experienced her own share of discrimination and harassment, but what she had endured paled in comparison to the stories she had covered over the years. Her hands were steady as she zoomed in on the interaction, her journalistic instincts taking over. Back at the scene, Samuel remained seated, unwilling to comply with Officer Daniels' demands, yet determined to keep his dignity intact. "Officer," Samuel said quietly, "I have no reason to show you my ID. I've done nothing wrong. I'm not disturbing anyone." Daniels' frustration was palpable. "You don't get to decide that. Now, I can either ask nicely, or I can take you in for questioning. Your choice." Samuel sighed, glancing down at the poetry book in his lap. He could feel his pulse quickening, the years of frustration and fatigue from a lifetime of injustice weighing on him. This wasn't about a simple ID check. He knew that. "Let me tell you something, officer," Samuel began, his voice calm but resolute. "I've been fighting for my rights longer than you've been alive. I marched for them, bled for them, and I won't let you or anyone else treat me like I don't belong in my own neighborhood." For a brief moment, Officer Daniels hesitated, clearly taken aback by the elder man's words. But whatever doubt flickered in his eyes was quickly replaced by a hardened resolve. "You have 5 seconds to get up and show me your ID, or we're going downtown," Daniels growled, now gripping his radio. From her vantage point, Jasmine watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of dread. She had seen enough. There was no telling what Officer Daniels might do next, and she couldn't risk standing idly by. But as she prepared to step in, something unexpected happened. Before Officer Daniels could finish counting, a voice rang out from behind him. "Officer Daniels, hold up." Daniels froze, then turned to see another man approaching, this one wearing plain clothes but with a badge clipped to his belt. It was Detective Richard Harmon, one of the most respected officers in the precinct, and also one of its few black detectives. He had been walking his dog in the park when he noticed the situation unfolding. His instincts told him something wasn't right. "Detective Harmon," Daniels said, sounding surprised. "What are you doing here?" "Enjoying a morning walk, same as everyone else," Harmon replied coolly. His eyes flicked over to Samuel, who was still seated, watching the exchange. "What's going on here?" Daniels looked momentarily unsure but then quickly straightened up. "This gentleman here is refusing to show me his ID. We had a report of suspicious activity, and he fits the description." Harmon raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious activity, huh?" He glanced at Samuel, who gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. Harmon had seen the elder man in the park many times before. "You sure about that, Daniels?" Daniels shifted uncomfortably. He refused to comply. "Refused to comply or refused to be harassed?" Harmon asked, his tone sharp. "Do you know who this is?" Daniels frowned. "No, I don't." "That's Samuel Wright," Harmon said, crossing his arms. "Mr. Wright has lived in this neighborhood longer than you and I combined. He's a pillar of this community. So, I'm going to ask you, what exactly are you accusing him of?" Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The weight of Harmon's authority, coupled with the realization that he had made a mistake, began to dawn on him. By now, a small crowd had gathered at a distance, drawn in by the tension. Jasmine, still recording, felt a wave of relief wash over her. She recognized Detective Harmon from a previous story she had covered, and she knew he wasn't the type to let injustice slide. Harmon turned back to Samuel, offering a respectful nod. "Mr. Wright, I'm sorry about this. You shouldn't have to deal with this nonsense." Samuel exhaled, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like hours. "Thank you, Detective. I appreciate that." Harmon looked at Daniels. "You need to apologize, too." For a long moment, Daniels remained silent, his pride warring with the realization that he was in the wrong. Finally, he cleared his throat. I'm sorry, sir. I was just doing my job." Samuel nodded, though the apology felt hollow. "Just doing your job, huh?" he said quietly. "I've heard that before." The tension in the air began to dissipate as the crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring amongst themselves. Jasmine lowered her phone, feeling a mixture of relief and anger. She knew that what she had witnessed was just one small example of a much larger problem, one that affected countless people every day. Detective Harmon stayed behind, making sure Samuel was all right. "You sure you're okay, Mr. Wright?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Samuel nodded. "I'm fine, son. I've been through worse, believe me." Harmon smiled sadly. I don't doubt that. But you shouldn't have to keep going through it. As Harmon and Samuel talked, Jasmine approached them. "Excuse me, Detective Harmon," she said, holding up her phone. "I've been recording this whole thing. I think the world needs to see what happened here." Harmon raised an eyebrow but didn't seem surprised. "I'm not going to stop you," he said. "People need to know." Samuel looked at Jasmine, his expression thoughtful. "What are you going to do with that footage, young lady?" Jasmine hesitated for a moment, then said, "I'm going to write about it. People need to know that this is still happening. They need to know that men like you are still being targeted for no reason." Samuel studied her for a long moment, then smiled. "I think that's a good idea." Over the next few days, Jasmine's article and the video footage of the incident in Greenwood Park spread like wildfire. It was shared across social media platforms, aired on local news stations, and became the subject of heated debates. People from all over the country weighed in, with some expressing outrage over the treatment of Samuel Wright, while others defended Officer Daniels' actions, claiming he was simply following protocol. The city's police department was forced to respond, with the police chief issuing a statement about the importance of de-escalation and community relations. Officer Daniels was put on temporary leave pending an internal investigation, while Detective Harmon was hailed as a hero for stepping in and defusing the situation. But for Samuel, it wasn't about the headlines or the public outcry. It was about something much deeper. He had lived long enough to know that change didn't come easily, and while this one incident had shone a spotlight on the issue, it was far from the end of the fight. One morning, about a week after the incident, Samuel returned to Greenwood Park. The leaves had begun to fall, carpeting the ground in shades of red and gold. He sat on his usual bench, opened Gloria's poetry book, and began to read. From across the pond, Jasmine sat on her bench, watching the old man in quiet reverence. She had done her part, but she knew the work was far from over. As Samuel read, a young boy approached him, a black boy, no older than 10. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said shyly. "Are you the man from the news?" Samuel chuckled softly. "I guess I am. My mom says you're a hero," the boy said, his eyes wide with admiration. Samuel smiled, shaking his head. "I'm no hero, son. Just a man trying to live in peace." The boy nodded, then turned and ran back to his mother, who was watching from a distance. As Samuel watched them leave, he couldn't help but think of the future, of the next generation that would grow up in this world. Maybe, just maybe, the ripples from that day in Greenwood Park would spread far enough to make a difference. But for now, he was content to sit quietly by the pond, savoring the peace that had, for too long, been denied to him.